I'm Karen Stevens, conducting an oral history interview with Margie Lee Szymanski
Mm-hmm.
on Monday, June 12th, 2017, for the Georgia State University's Women's March Oral History Project. We right now are located in the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And Margie, before we talk about your experiences regarding the Women's March, I'd like to get a little background information about you. Where were you born?
I was born in upstate New York.
How did you get from New York to Atlanta?
I followed my husband, who took a job in 1996 at a company called the Child Welfare Institute.
And what year were you born?
1952.
When you were growing up, did your family have political leanings?
No,
No.
not particularly. I grew up in a very Roman Catholic family, and that was more important than politics, except when JFK ran. And when JFK ran, we suddenly got very interested in politics. And but beyond that, no, not really.
What's your profession?
I'm a retired social worker.
Is there a political party that you support?
Democrats,
Democrats.
all the way.
Have you been involved in political activities before?
Not a whole lot. I was involved during my college years because that was the Vietnam era. And so I was very involved in protesting and marching at that time. But since then, as an adult, no, I really haven't been. I've always voted. I've always supported Democratic candidates, but as far as marching and protesting and being active, not so much.
Have you or any of your family members participated in any marches in the past?
I don't believe so. I think I'm the only one.
And no marches before you? You have not participated in any marches?
Not
before?
since Vietnam.
Okay. So let me ask you about the march. When and where were you when you were thinking about, maybe this is something I ought to do, march?
I was sitting in my home, in my TV room, watching television and watching the news. I had watched the election. I stayed up and watched the results. I was horrified. I was devastated. I was saying earlier that I work with a refugee family, and this was their first election and their first opportunity to learn about how the election works, and I had said, Hillary's going to win. It will be fine. Because they were also watching Mr. Trump, and they were very, very frightened. And I remember when he won, and Lubala texted me and said, is this right? Did he win? And I said, yes, he did. So at that point, I was just so agitated and anxious and distraught about this. I didn't know how I was going to get over this or how I was going to cope with it. And the next day, I was texting with a friend, and she said, we're going to Washington. And I said, I'll go. I'm in. My two friends were from New York. They were driving down, and I flew and met them in Alexandria, and the next day we went to the march.
This was the march. Which march did you
The
attend?
March on Washington.
Why did you choose to do that particular march?
Because I felt it was going to be a big statement. I felt it was going to be a strong statement. And I knew there were marches around the country, and I knew there was one in Atlanta, which I would have gone to had I not gone to Washington, but I had this opportunity, and I felt like I had so much anxiety over this and just so much of a sense of unease and unrest that the only way to cope with that for me was to do something. And I felt this was something big that I could do. And so that's what drove me to make that decision. And I'm so glad I went.
What was the issue that was most important to you?
Oh my gosh, it's really hard to say Healthcare is huge for me. Women's reproductive rights are huge for me. Racism is huge for me, including the Muslim ban. The environment is huge for me. So I think those are the three big ones, but human rights in general, rights of people of color, LGBT community, rights of people with disabilities, all of these I thought and still think are under threat. They're threatened by this administration. And my fears about this administration have only been confirmed day by day by day. I guess I have to say it's worse than I expected.
Was this your first time in participating in a protest?
In a big protest, yes. Yes, I went to a small state college in upstate New York, and that was during the Vietnam era. So we did marches and so forth, but nothing to the size and scope of this march.
What were your expectations about the march before you left to go to the march?
I think that my expectation was that a large group of people would come together and make a statement just by their presence. That would be a statement in itself, and it was. It clearly was. The speakers, although I couldn't hear them all because you can't imagine the size of this if you're not there, but the speakers that I heard, Linda Sarsour, Ashley Judd, who I never expected, but she's a real radical. She pulled no punches. And so that was just very, very inspiring.
And what was it like, the trip to Washington?
I flew.
You flew.
So it was easy for me. And I met friends, and we stayed in Alexandria, old Alexandria. And I was very fortunate because I have no sense of direction at all. But one of my friends had a very good sense of a direction, so she navigated us through the metro and up to the march, and we got up as close as we could. And so she was able to navigate us. But every time we moved, we held hands. We were a chain, because that was really the only way to move. The crowd was so dense.
What was it like as you got closer to the march? You were on the metro. Did it seem
The
like
metro was packed. And the lines to the metro were packed. So it took a long time even to get on the train. But on the train and at the march and at the outskirts of the march, as you moved in toward it, the spirit was just, again, it was just so inspiring. I saw families with little children, dads walking with their children on their shoulders, old people, people in wheelchairs, all kinds of people. And that was what was so moving to me, was that this is not a partisan thing. It's not a narrow thing. It's wide and it's deep. And people feel strongly. And so I met so many just wonderful people.
How did you feel when you saw the dad with the kid and
Sometimes I wonder why are we so impressed when we see men at these events? Why is it always the women that are taking charge? But those men were there for their wives and their daughters and their mothers and the future generations, and some of them were just the sweetest guys you could ever meet. And they were carrying signs, the signs, I wish I had thought before the interview to remember some of the signs, but they were just wonderful. One of my friends that I went with is a quilter, and she made a quilt about this big. And it was an Amy Goodman quote. And it said, "Go where the silence is and say something." And so rather than a sign, the three of us carried this quilt.
Describe your fellow marchers, the other women that you marched with. Can you describe
The women and the men and the children. To see a crowd that big and to see such patience, such kindness, such solidarity. As I said before, people with wheelchairs who are moving slowly through this immense and dense crowd, and people making room for them to let them through. At one point, a little child got separated from his parents. The child was somewhere behind me, the parents were somewhere in front of me, you couldn't really see. And at first, people were passing notes back to say, here's this child, his parents are up front, can you move him across your shoulders, kind of, lift him across the crowd, and the child was too afraid to do that. So the crowd separated while a police officer came down through and picked up the child and brought him back to his parents. It was that kind of, at one point there was an ambulance that needed to come through, and again, people would shout from behind, move forward, move left, ambulance coming through, and people did that. Even though there was almost nowhere to go, but people made it happen. So it was the kindness and the patience that impressed me.
What were your feelings during the march? What was the atmosphere, the general atmosphere of the march?
Festive. It was festive. It was joyful. It was powerful. Again, the speakers were just inspiring. People helped each other. People gave things away. I ran into some people, I didn't have a pink hat, so someone said, here, take a pink hat. Someone gave me a bracelet that said, nevertheless, she persisted. So,
Wow.
People were just so kind and generous.
From the speakers, is there anything that stands out from the speakers that you heard, that you recall?
I recall Ashley Judd because she pulled no punches. She talked about women's rights. She used the word abortion. She was a powerful speaker. And the other one that I remember clearly was Linda Sarsour, because she is an Arab American, she is a Muslim. She spoke not only about the Muslim ban and the treatment of Muslims in this country, but the treatment of all people affected by this administration, including people of color, people with disabilities, women. Her message was broad and wide, and she's a powerful speaker. So I really was very inspired by her.
And we talked a little bit about the signs that you
Yes.
saw.
Yes.
And did y'all do any chants?
Oh yeah. This is what America looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Yeah. There was a lot of chanting.
A lot of chanting going on around different.
Yes. And it would start at the front and go back, or start at the back and go front.
The
But
same.
you could sort of hear it. Yeah. Because the crowd was so big, if you started a chant, not everyone could hear it, so it had to travel back. Which again, it gave you a sense of the scope of the thing, the size of it.
It's hard to imagine.
It is, and I thought, oh, would I love to be up in a little helicopter and be able to have a view of this thing.
Did you watch any of the media before, during, or after?
Afterward, I did, yeah. And the other thing that was so powerful was the sister marches all around the world. There were women, and I believe it was at the South Pole, a small group of women scientists who came together and had pictures taken and video of themselves participating. It really convinced me that what I was feeling was not, I was not alone, and that there is a huge groundswell of women and men who are feeling the same.
Did you see law enforcement at the march?
I did, and I have to say, law enforcement were respectful, they were helpful. Like I said with that little boy, the law enforcement folks that I saw were waving to the crowd and helping them and directing them. There was no sense of us versus them, or we're guarding you. I really felt that they were on our side, and they were there to protect us and make sure that we were safe. And I contrast this with some of the videos that I've seen of Trump rallies, where people are punching each other out and have to be dragged out by law enforcement. And I just think that's kind of a metaphor for the difference between these two worldviews, or these two senses of what's right and what's wrong. And so I just, and I thanked them every time I saw them. I said, thank you so much.
How did your group manage to stay together with a crowd that size, pushing and
We
pulling?
held hands. Every time we needed to move, there were 3 of us, we held hands tightly, and if we couldn't all get through, we waited until, and that was a good thing because I can get lost going around the block. So I needed to know that I was connected to my 2 people. That's how we got around.
How long did the march take?
We left the hotel around 7:30. We probably arrived at the march around 10 o'clock in the morning, and we started our way out at around 3. So I think the march lasted longer, but we started moving out because we knew it was going to take us a while, and it did. We got to the metro maybe 5 o'clock.
And what was that like?
Crowded.
What was the atmosphere?
Lines, but again,
after?
joyful, celebrating. Just everybody celebrating.
How did you feel?
The day. Oh, elated. My friends and I, all of us, we just felt like, oh, we have been part of something so positive and so historic. And we all felt like this was one of the biggest things we've done in our lives.
And how did you feel later that day?
Wonderful. We all went out to dinner. There were many people that we encountered who had been at the march. One of the families that we met had flown in, and Jimmy Carter was on their plane. And Jimmy Carter had gone through the plane and shook hands and introduced himself to every person on the plane. So again, it was just such a joyful thing.
Did you feel emotional at any time during the march? What was that about?
The emotions were relief, and it's an overused word, but the emotion for me was empowerment. It was a sense of, we can do something. And that was my despair after the election was, what can we do? We have to do something. And after the march, I thought, okay, this is the beginning. We will do something. We will move forward. When I got home, I live in a suburban neighborhood, just inside the perimeter, and I belong to the next door group. And I don't know a lot of people. And really, most of my friends are still up in New York. So I put out a note on my next door group, and I said, I just came back from the march. I am so inspired. I need a few people who will be marching buddies for me, because I know there's more to come. I expected 4 or 5 people would respond. I had over 180 responses. We now have formed an indivisible group. We're the Indivisible Marching Buddies of Atlanta. And we're a pretty active group.
So you've attended marches since the...
Oh, yes, yes.
Talk about that.
The first one, I think after the election, was the march at the airport, after the Muslim ban, and that was big. That was very, very big, and a very enthusiastic crowd. I went to the March for Healthcare. Recently, a couple weeks ago, we had the March for Science, which was also just such an upbeat event. It was wonderful. So, and that kind of thing is carried on. And right now, my group is very focused on the Ossoff election, and we're working real hard on that.
So, how did your family and friends respond to your idea, your need to go march?
You know, they're okay with it. As I said, my family is not very political. And some of my family members would lean more to the right. But they've been supportive. I mean, they've been okay with it. No one has challenged me or said you shouldn't have done that. So there's been none of that. And I've just said, you know, even though we may differ, this is important. And I think folks understand that. Even the more conservative members of my family, as they watched this administration and they watched the cabinet appointments being made, began to understand that this is not as Paul Ryan says, it's an unconventional presidency. And they began to understand that it's a dangerous presidency.
Did you see any protesters when you were at the march in January up in D.C.?
No,
I mean,
counter-protesters? No,
counter-protesters, right.
no, I didn't. I may have been too deep in the crowd, because you couldn't see anything beyond, you know. So, no, I didn't. But I'll tell you what, I know our crowds were bigger than Trump's inauguration crowds. There's no arguing about that.
What do you plan to do now that you've returned?
I am holding my breath until June 20th. And after June 20th, if John Ossoff should lose, I will go into a depression for a few days, but then I'll get back up. And the marching buddies have talked about this and trying to prepare ourselves, but also understanding while the Ossoff race is a sprint, the bigger issues are not. This is a race. It's a long-term race, and the issues aren't going away. So we'll continue.
So what do you hope will happen?
I hope that Democrats will take the Senate in 2018, and I wish they would take the House. Although I'm not quite so optimistic about that one, but at least that we will fill some seats with Democrats.
Do you have any fears?
Yes, that we won't. I also, frankly, and I know many people have different feelings about this, but around the Trump impeachment issue, I kind of hope he doesn't get impeached. I kind of hope that he lives out these 4 years and continues to show us the kind of man he is. If he is impeached, we'll have Mike Pence. And Mike Pence is just a quieter, more savvy version of Donald Trump. And so in that sense, I almost think he's more dangerous. And if Pence is brought down because of his connections with the Russians and Michael Flynn and all that business, then we'll have Paul Ryan. And, you know, it can't get better. It can't get better. So I'm hoping for 2020 that we'll have a Democrat in place. I would love to see Mr. Biden run.
Did any part of the march surprise you in any way?
The size surprised me. The size. I think I expected that there would be, I think they were saying maybe 3,000 to 4,000 people, 100,000 people. Now I've seen estimates that there were over 800,000 people, so that surprised me. And also I had never been in a crowd that big, so I had no concept of what that was even like.
When did you get a sense of the crowd size? Was it when you got off the metro? Was it later that day?
Yeah, as we got off the metro and walked towards, and of course in a crowd that size there's outskirts of the crowd and people who are kind of hanging out and didn't want to be right in the thick of it. But we wanted to be in the thick of it. So we walked up as far as we could. I think we got to 4th or 5th Street and then made our way in to the center. So we were right in the middle of it. Which was a great place to be. Again, because of the people surrounding us. Thank God I don't have a fear of crowds or that kind of phobia, because to me it was just invigorating. It was just, it brought me to life.
How have you felt about the new government's activities since the march?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It's just been one thing after another. You know, beginning with the cabinet appointments. And we were some of those people who were calling our representatives, calling and calling. When the phone lines jammed, we started faxing. Every single cabinet appointment has been appointed to dismantle the cabinet which they direct. The appointment of Scott Pruitt to the EPA was, it was inconceivable. And since then, you know, the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, the refusal to acknowledge to NATO that we're all in this together, the leaking of information to the Russians in a closed room, all of these errors in judgment, errors in thinking things through, the lack of knowledge and understanding and the lack of curiosity, even the lack of desire to learn about the issues that this man is making decisions about, often seemingly off the cuff. And, you know, I think that our standing in the world has really suffered. I'm amazed that Europe is as patient as it is with us. I think they sort of feel like, well, you know, in 4 years this will be over. But everything that's happened is just reaffirmed and reaffirmed and reaffirmed. I really believe that our president is mentally ill. I believe that. Yeah. There are a group of psychiatrists at Yale University who were participating in a conference, and they held a panel on this subject. And while the American Psychiatric Association has a policy that you cannot comment on a person's mental health or diagnose them if you have not met them, these psychiatrists have come together and said, you know what, this is more important than that policy. This is so important that people understand. So I have a great respect for that. I was very happy to hear it because I think it's true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have any advice for people who are trying to cope with this new administration, feeling, I don't know, helpless or hopeless?
I have two things. One is I have a friend, and one of our marching buddies is a psychotherapist. And she said the day after the election, her phone began to ring. And she said, I myself was feeling so anxious and just so, disturbed by this. And here are my patients calling me with the same feelings. So, and one thing I would say is if you can't get past it or you can't somehow get your arms around it, go and talk to somebody. The second thing, and the thing that I was feeling most strongly, was do something. Do something. after the march, there was a lot of stuff coming out, suggestions about what people should do, and one that stands out to me was a woman who said, it doesn't so much matter what you do, is that you do something. If that means you volunteer with refugees, or you volunteer with disabled children, or you offer something, you contribute something. You don't even have to march if you don't want to, but know that you're on the right side and you're doing something to help. So those are the two things that come to mind for me.
If anybody's considering marching in the future, what sort of advice would you give them?
I would say do it. Do it. It's fun. It's fun. Make yourself a sign. Get out there and do it. Again, because there's so much camaraderie and so much even humor among people. And when you look at the signs, some of them are just so funny. The signs at the March for Science, 2 + 2 does not equal 5. Just some really witty and funny signs. And there was a man walking around dressed like a wizard, an older man walking around dressed like a wizard, and he said, I'm Trump's scientific advisor. So it's a lot of fun.
So as we start to wrap up, I want to give you a chance to talk about anything that you wanted to talk about but that we didn't get to.
I want to say that there are many, many groups organizing. There's the indivisible groups are popping up all over the place. Planned Parenthood has become very, very active. There's lots of opportunities to connect with people. And if you have a particular issue, like women's reproductive rights, connect with Planned Parenthood, volunteer for them, send them money. The other thing I would say is, while we're watching this race in Georgia really closely right now, there are many other races going on around the country, and after June 20th, one of my personal goals is to educate myself about those races and to do what I can. Because to me, a position in the House of Representatives, while you represent a district in Georgia, you also represent the whole country. It's kind of like air pollution. It doesn't stop at the border of Georgia and Alabama. It's a countrywide thing, and I feel the same about our elected officials. So I would say pay attention to some of those other races, because we really need to flip some seats very quickly.
Do you think this whole experience, this march, has changed you in any way?
It's reaffirmed me. It's strengthened me. It's given me more resolve, because I have something to be resolved against now. Now I don't want to say the enemy, but now I see what I'm up against, what we're up against.
And with that, I think that brings to close the interview, and I just wanted to say thank you, Margie, so much for taking the time to be here and talk about your experiences. For people who may watch this now or in the future, I think it's very valuable. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.